The Golden Crystal wasn't just a restaurant, it was an institution in New York City. Located in a historic mansion in the Upper East Side, its exposed brick walls and arched windows held half a century of fine dining history. For Richard Miller, who had been circulating through that Italian marble-floored dining room for 15 years, each table was a small territory under his domain. That Thursday night, like every other, Richard meticulously adjusted the knot of his burgundy tie in front of the locker room mirror. His graying hair at the temples was carefully combed back, and his impeccable posture reflected years of self-imposed refinement. At 45, he considered himself not just a waiter, but a curator of the dining experience. Miller, table 15 arriving, announced Paul the maitre d' through the half-open door. "It's the Rothschilds." A discreet smile appeared at the corner of Richard's lips. The Rothschilds were regular customers, the kind he appreciated serving. They knew wines, could correctly pronounce French dishes, and most importantly, truly, belonged in that environment. The Golden Crystal's main dining room was a spectacle of crystal and silver cutlery, where Art Deco chandeliers poured golden light over Egyptian linen tablecloths. Richard glided between tables like a conductor, leading his own symphony of impeccable service. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Rothschild," he greeted with a slight bow. "The Chateau Lafite 2015 that you enjoy is already at the ideal temperature." "Always attentive, Richard," replied Mr. Rothschild, a gentleman with white hair and gold-rimmed glasses. "But today we'll try something different. I trust your suggestion." It was in these moments that Richard felt truly in his element. He began describing a newly arrived Burgundy to the wine list, his words flowing with the precision of someone who knew every bottle in the climate-controlled cellar. The service was proceeding with its usual smoothness when Paul appeared again, this time with a slightly annoyed expression. "Miller, I need you to handle table 8 too. Carmen has her hands full." Richard nodded discreetly, but his eyes were already seeking to assess the new clients. His expression subtly changed as his eyes fell on table 8. A woman alone, whom he estimated to be about 40, occupied one of the best tables in the dining room. She wore a black channel that in his opinion didn't flatter her, and her generous form seemed out of place among the Golden Crystal's usually slender clientele. "Good evening," he said, his polite tone masking a calculated coldness. "Welcome to the Golden Crystal." The woman raised her eyes from the menu and looked at him with a serenity that, for some reason, bothered him. There was something in her gaze that seemed to pierce through his mask of professional cordiality. "Good evening," she replied, her voice melodious and controlled. "It's my first time here. Could you recommend something?" Richard allowed a moment of silence to extend beyond comfortable before responding. "Perhaps Madam would prefer to start with something more light. We have an exceptional selection. To have salads." The comment hung in the air like an unwanted cloud of smoke. The woman kept her gaze fixed on him for a few seconds before an enigmatic smile appeared on her lips. "Actually," she said, closing the menu delicately, "I would like to try the complete tasting menu, with wine pairing, please." Richard couldn't prevent his eyebrows from rising slightly. The tasting menu was a 3-hour journey through 8 elaborate dishes, an experience few customers ventured to do alone. "Are you sure, madam? It's a substantial experience." "Absolutely," she replied, returning the menu to him with a smooth movement. "And don't worry about the time. I have all evening to appreciate what the Golden Crystal has to offer." As he walked away to arrange the order, Richard felt something unusual, a hint of irritation he couldn't fully explain. There was something about this woman's behavior that disturbed him, a confidence that seemed to challenge his preconceptions. What he didn't know was that this night would mark the beginning of a transformation that would shake the structures of his small crystal kingdom, where he had reigned supreme for so long. The first cracks in his armor of superiority were beginning to form, still invisible but inexorable as time. The night advanced at the Golden Crystal, and Richard alternated, his attention between tables with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. For the Rothschilds, each of his gestures overflowed with deference and cultivated familiarity. For the woman at table 8, his movements were technically perfect, but devoid of warmth. The first course of the tasting menu, he announced with icy formality, seared scallop with Sicilian lemon foam and caviar. He made a studied pause before adding, accompanied by a Chablis Premier. Creators. The woman observed the plate with genuine interest, completely ignoring Richard's condescending tone. Her gestures when handling the cutlery revealed familiarity with haute cuisine, something that surprised him slightly. The acidity of the Sicilian lemon perfectly balances the natural sweetness of the scallop, she commented after the first bite. And the choice of Chablis is quite traditional, but appropriate. Richard felt his face harden for a moment. The observation was accurate and demonstrated knowledge, challenging his expectations. He limited himself to a restrained nod before withdrawing. Over the next 2 hours, each return to table 8 brought a new surprise. The woman not only knew every ingredient and technique, but made pertinent observations about the composition of the dishes and the choice of wines. Her behavior remained unshakable in the face of Richard's small-veiled provocations. The sauce in this dish, she commented during the 5th course, reminds me very much of what was served here in the 90s when Maurice Leblanc was the chef. The mention of the former chef made Richard falter momentarily. Few knew this detail of the restaurant's history, and even fewer remembered Leblanc's specific style. Between one service and another, Richard noticed Paul, the maitre d', observing him more closely than usual. Twice he caught Mr. Torres, the manager, standing near the sideboard, his attentive eyes following every movement of the waiters. Miller, Paul called in a low voice as he passed by the service station. Is the customer at 8 some food critic? She made several notes on her cell phone. Impossible, Richard replied with barely disguised disdain. I would know if she were. However, an uncomfortable sensation was beginning to settle at the nape of his neck. There was something in the air, a subtle change in the restaurant's atmosphere that he couldn't fully define. Near the end of the service, when he brought the dessert, an elaborate construction of Grand Cru chocolate with edible gold, the woman surprised him again. Mr. Miller, she said, her tone as serene as it had been all evening, I would like to thank you for the service. It was revealing. Then she slid an envelope across the table, along with the payment for the bill. Richard opened the envelope after she left. Inside was a generous tip, well above the usual even by the Golden Crystal standards. Along with it, a card on high-quality vellum paper bore only one sentence. True elegance is not measured by appearances. The envelope from table 8, said Paul, approaching with curiosity. Any problem? Nothing important, Richard replied, quickly tucking the card into his vest pocket, but his hands trembled slightly as he organized the day's checks. The following week, the first changes began to manifest. Subtle at first, like drops before a storm. Richard noticed that some regular customers began to request other waiters. Mr. Rothschild, who always insisted on being served by him, now preferred Carmen's service. During a morning meeting, before lunch, Mr. Torres made an announcement that caused a stir among the employees. As you may have heard in the backstage, we are in negotiation with a new investor, he said, adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses. The changes will be gradual but significant. We expect to raise the Golden Crystal's standard even higher. Richard observed his colleagues' reactions. Some seemed anxious, others concerned. Carmen was smiling, as if she knew something the Sioux. Others didn't. And Miller, Mr. Torres called as the meeting was ending. I need you to pay more attention to training the newcomers. We're going to need a more adaptable team. The word adaptable echoed in Richard's ears like a warning. For the first time in 15 years, he felt that his territory wasn't as secure as he had imagined. The walls of the Golden Crystal, which had always made him feel like a king in his castle, now seemed to be observing him with different eyes. That night, as he tidied his locker in the changing room, he found a recent culinary magazine with an anonymous review of the Golden Crystal. The text praised the cuisine, but made veiled mentions of a certain elitism in the service that needed to be reviewed. Richard closed the magazine with unnecessary force. An uncomfortable sensation was beginning to take shape in his mind. The woman at table 8 hadn't been just another customer. She represented something bigger, a change that was just beginning. The New York autumn arrived with a cool breeze that seemed to herald changes. At the Golden Crystal, the first signs of the new administration were beginning to materialize. Richard observed with growing unease the subtle alterations in the restaurant's routine. "Starting today," Mr. Torres announced during the morning meeting, "we will implement a new service evaluation system. Customers will receive a discrete digital form at the end of each meal." The news caused a murmur among the employees. Richard maintained his neutral expression, but his hands closed involuntarily under the table. 15 years of impeccable service, and now he would be evaluated by anyone who walked through the door. "Additionally," Torres continued, "we will receive a special client tonight. He requested exclusivity in service." His eyes landed directly on Richard. "Miller, you will be responsible for this table." The rest of the day passed with palpable tension. Richard dedicated himself to polishing already gleaming glasses, a habit he had acquired to calm his nerves. His thoughts constantly returned to the woman at table 8, who hadn't returned since that peculiar night. "Have you seen the new menu they're developing?" Carmen commented, approaching the service station. "I heard the new partner is personally involved in the selection of dishes." "New partner?" Richard questioned, trying to mask his surprise. It was the first time he had heard mention of the mysterious investor's gender. "Oh, you didn't know," Carmen replied with a smile that bordered on satisfaction. "I thought you, always so well informed about everything, were already aware." Before he could probe for more information, Paul appeared announcing the arrival of the special client. "Table 12, Miller. He's already waiting." The man occupying table 12 emanated an aura of natural authority. He appeared to be about 60 years old, wore an impeccable Italian suit, and his astute eyes seemed to catalogue every detail of the environment. Richard approached, feeling strangely exposed under that analytical gaze. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Golden Crystal." "Good evening," the man replied in a deep and melodious voice. "Richard Miller, correct? Your reputation precedes you." The comment, apparently complimentary, carried a weight that Richard couldn't decipher. For the next 2 hours, he felt as if he were performing for an invisible audience. The client observed his every movement with meticulous attention, asking occasional questions about the restaurant and its history. "You've worked here for a long time, haven't you?" the man inquired between courses. "You must have known Maurice Leblanc." For the second time in a few weeks, the name of the former chef came up in a conversation. "Yes, sir, I had that privilege." "Interesting," the client murmured, savoring his wine. "That was a special time for the Golden Crystal. Many interesting stories." At the end of the night, the man left without further comments, leaving only a business card on the table. Richard picked it up with curiosity, but the card contained only a name, Alexander Montgomery, and a phone number. The next day, the first digital evaluation arrived in the system. It was about his service from the previous night. The text was meticulous, highlighting both qualities and areas for development. The analysis was so precise and deep that it seemed to have been written by someone who knew not only the service, but the very essence of the Golden Crystal. "Torres wants to see you in management," Paul informed, interrupting his reading. "Now." As he walked towards the office, Richard felt the weight of each step. The walls of the restaurant, which for so long had been his allies, now seemed to conspire against him. Something was changing at the Golden Crystal, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he could maintain control over his small kingdom. The management office had always been a familiar environment for Richard, but that morning, it seemed strangely hostile. Mr. Torres wasn't alone. Beside him, an elegant woman of about 50 occupied one of the chairs, her back perfectly straight and a tablet in her hands. "Miller, this is Helen Vasquez, our new service consultant," Torres introduced, his tone more formal than usual. "She's conducting a complete analysis of our operations." Richard felt a chill in the pit of his stomach as he recognized the last name. Vasquez was a traditional family in the gastronomy business, known for transforming traditional establishments into modern successes. "Mr. Miller," Helen began, her voice soft but firm, "I've been analyzing the service reports from recent months. We've noticed an interesting pattern in your interactions with certain customers. She slid her finger across the tablet screen, continuing. Some effusive compliments, it's true, but also a growing number of complaints about differential treatment. Do you have anything to say about that? Richard maintained his impeccable posture, years of practice in masking emotions coming to the fore. I've always maintained the highest standard of service, Mrs. Vasquez. Perhaps some customers aren't accustomed to the level of formality that the golden crystal requires. Helen raised her eyes from the tablet, her penetrating gaze inexplicably reminiscent of the woman from Table 8. True luxury, Mr. Miller, isn't in exclusion, but in the ability to make everyone feel special. The meeting continued with a series of new guidelines and expectations. Richard listened, nodding at appropriate moments, but his mind was elsewhere. The pieces were starting to fit together. The changes, the evaluations, the mysterious client. Everything seemed part of a larger plan. As he left the office, he found Carmen organizing the wines in the cellar. Her knowing smile irritated him deeply. "So how was the meeting?" she asked, adjusting a bottle of Bordeaux on the shelf. "I heard Helen Vasquez is known for making drastic changes in the places she passes through." "Since when do you know so much about these things, Carmen?" Richard retorted, his usual composure beginning to crack. "Oh, you'd be surprised how much people share when they don't feel judged," she replied, leaving him with his doubts. The rest of the week brought more news. A new training menu was implemented, requiring all waiters to participate in workshops on inclusive hospitality. Richard, accustomed to being the example to follow, now found himself having to relearn basic concepts of service. During one of these training sessions, an old photo of the restaurant caught his attention. In the image yellowed by time, a group of people posed in front of the golden crystal. Among them, a young woman stood out who seemed strangely familiar to him. "This photo is from when the restaurant reopened in the 90s, the instructor explained. After the Vasquez family sold their stake, Richard approached the image, his heart racing. The young woman in the photo had the same serene and determined look as the woman from Table 8. But before he could examine it more closely, the instructor put the photograph away. That night, as he tidied his workstation, he found an envelope in his drawer. Inside, there was only a card with a handwritten message. "The past always finds a way to return to the present." The handwriting was identical to that on the card left by the woman from Table 8. Richard sat heavily in a nearby chair, his certainties crumbling like a house of cards. The golden crystal held secrets that he, even after 15 years, had never suspected. And now those secrets seemed to be emerging from the shadows, threatening not only his position, but the entire reality he had built for himself. The New York Public Library kept decades of newspapers and magazines in its digital collection. Richard had never imagined he would spend his day off scouring old publications, but the photograph from the training session wouldn't leave his mind. He needed to understand the connection between the golden crystal's past and recent events. "Looking for something specific?" asked the librarian, adjusting her tortoiseshell glasses as she observed Richard navigate through the files. "Articles about the Golden Crystal restaurant, especially from the 90s, he replied, trying to maintain a casual tone. The first discoveries were surprising. The restaurant had originally belonged to the Vasquez family, having been founded by Antonio Vasquez, a Spanish immigrant, in 1965. In the old photos, the establishment already displayed the same architectural elegance, albeit with a more family-oriented approach. "Vasquez family sells traditional restaurant," said a headline from 1992. Richard read the article with growing attention. The sale had happened after a series of disagreements between the partners. The name of Maurice Leblanc, the former chef, appeared several times in the text. One photo in particular caught his attention. It showed a young Sofia Vasquez, Antonio's daughter, next to Leblanc. The caption mentioned her precocious talent in gastronomy and her studies in France. It was undeniably the same woman from the training photo. "I found some more references," said the librarian, returning with a folder, "including a series of recent restaurant reviews. I thought it might interest you." Richard leafed through the recent reviews with growing unease. They all mentioned significant changes in traditional restaurants in the city. In each case, a pattern repeated itself. The arrival of a mysterious investor followed by gradual transformations in the establishment's culture. His cell phone vibrated, interrupting his reading. It was a message from Mr. Torres. Extraordinary meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m., mandatory attendance. Upon returning home that night, Richard found an envelope without a return address in his mailbox. Inside, there was only an old photo of the Golden Crystal and a note. Some stories need to be retold to be understood. The photo showed the restaurant's main dining room at its inauguration. In the center, Antonio Vasquez smiled proudly, and beside him, a girl of approximately 10 years old held a small recipe book. The detail that made Richard freeze was the date written on the back, 1985. If his suspicions were correct, the new partner wasn't just any investor. It was someone who knew every inch of that place, every story kept within its walls, someone who, for reasons still obscure, had waited for the right moment to return. The night was long, populated by unsettling thoughts. For the first time, Richard began to question not only his future at the Golden Crystal, but also his understanding of the very establishment he thought he knew so well. Tomorrow would be a new day, and the extraordinary meeting promised more revelations. What had once seemed like a simple administrative change now revealed itself as part of a much more complex and personal story. A story of which, unknowingly, he had become a central character. The Golden Crystal's meeting room had never seemed so small as it did that morning. All employees were present, creating a dense atmosphere of expectation. Richard took his usual place, observing the faces around him. Some showed anxiety, others curiosity, but Carmen maintained a serene smile that intrigued him more and more. Mr. Torres entered, accompanied by Helen Vasquez, and a man Richard immediately recognized. Alexander Montgomery, the mysterious client from table 12. The murmur ceased instantly. "Good morning, everyone," Torres began, his voice more formal than usual. "As you know, the Golden Crystal is going through a period of transformation. Today, I would like to officially introduce our new majority partner." The door opened once more, and Richard felt his heart stop for an instant. The woman from table entered the room, wearing an elegant navy blue suit. Her gaze swept the room until it found his, and for a moment, Richard saw in those eyes the same sparkle as the girl in the old photograph. "Sofia Vasquez," Torres introduced. "Daughter of the Golden Crystal's founder, Antonio Vasquez." A murmur ran through the room. Sofia took the floor, her calm and controlled voice filling the environment. "Many of you must be wondering about the recent changes. Some people met me as a customer, others through evaluations, but today I'm here to tell a story." She paused, her eyes again meeting Richard's. "This restaurant was more than a business for my family. It was my father's dream, a place where true hospitality knew no distinctions, where every customer, regardless of appearance or origin, deserved to be treated with dignity." Richard felt the weight of each word. Memories of the past months, his derogatory comments, the looks of disdain, the small humiliations he had inflicted, began to accumulate in his conscience. "In recent months," Sofia continued, "we conducted a deep analysis not only of the processes, but of the Golden Crystal's culture. We observed, documented, and primarily experienced firsthand how our customers are treated." Alexander Montgomery took the floor. "As a hospitality consultant, I have rarely seen an establishment with so much potential and so many contradictions. Technical excellence coexisting with veiled discrimination, tradition being used as a shield for prejudices." Richard maintained his rigid posture, but inside he felt his certainties crumbling. Each word was like a mirror forcing him to see his own distorted reflection. "However," Sofia resumed, her voice softening, "we are not here to point fingers or seek culprits. We are here to recover the Golden Crystal's essence, to reconnect this place with its original values." Helen Vasquez distributed folders containing the new training program and updated guidelines. Richard opened his, finding on the first page an old photo. Antonio Vasquez personally serving a table, his face lit up by a genuine smile. My father used to say, Sophia concluded, that a restaurant is not made just of dishes and wines, but of moments and memories. Each person who crosses that door brings with them a story and deserves to be part of ours. The meeting continued with technical details and schedules, but Richard barely listened. His mind was trapped in a spiral of reflections. Years of building, a reputation based on criteria that now revealed themselves as empty. The irony of having been evaluated and judged in the same way he used to judge others did not escape him. When the meeting ended, Sophia approached his chair. "Mr. Miller, I'd like to speak with you privately. There are some stories we need to share." Sofia Vasquez's newly installed private office on the Golden Crystal's mezzanine maintained the restaurant's elegance, but with personal touches that caught Richard's attention. On the walls, old photographs of the establishment told a silent story. On a shelf, a recipe book worn by time occupied a place of prominence. "Do you recognize this book, Mr. Miller?" Sophia asked, picking up the object with reverential care. It was Chef Leblanc's. Each recipe here tells a story of the Golden Crystal. Richard observed the book with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Yes, ma'am. The chef always consulted it during service." Actually, Sophia opened the book to a specific page. Many of these recipes were created by my father and Leblanc together. They shared a vision about gastronomy that went beyond the dishes. It was about creating memorable experiences for everyone. She paused, her eyes scanning the yellowed page. "Do you know why I chose to be your customer that night?" Richard remained silent, his body tense in the leather chair. "Because for months we received reports about how you personified exactly the opposite of what the Golden Crystal should represent. Impeccable technical excellence, but an arrogance that drove people away. I needed to see for myself." The words hit Richard like cold water. "Mrs. Vasquez, I always sought to maintain the standards that—" "The standards?" she interrupted, her voice soft but firm. "Let me tell you a story, Mr. Miller. In 1992, when we sold the restaurant, it wasn't just a business we lost. We lost a legacy. My father had built a place where excellence coexisted with warmth, where luxury was in the care, not in exclusion." Sophia stood up, walking to the window that offered a view of the main dining room. "For years I observed from afar as the Golden Crystal transformed into something different. A symbol of status, yes, but also of veiled segregation. Every time I heard stories about customers being subtly humiliated or made to feel inadequate, it was like reliving the pain of that forced sale." Richard felt his throat tighten. Memories of countless moments when he had judged, belittled and excluded customers passed through his mind like an uncomfortable film. "But I didn't call you here for accusations," Sophia continued, turning to him. "I called you because, despite everything, I recognize in you something my father always valued: dedication. You love this place, Mr. Miller. You've just lost sight of what really matters." She took a yellowed envelope from a drawer. "These are letters from customers about you over the years, both the compliments and the complaints. I'd like you to read them. Sometimes we need to see our reflection through the eyes of others to truly see ourselves." Richard took the envelope with slightly trembling hands. The weight of the paper seemed to carry more than just words. "The Golden Crystal is changing, Mr. Miller, not to become less special, but to recover its true essence. The question is, are you willing to be part of this transformation?" The question hung in the air like a prolonged musical note. For the first time in his career, Richard found himself facing a challenge that no technical training could solve. It was a matter of choice: continue being who he had always been, or allow himself to transform along with the place he loved so much. The following weeks brought changes that Richard had never imagined experiencing at the Golden Crystal. The restaurant maintained its characteristic elegance, but there was something different in the air. A lightness that had long been lost, a human warmth that transcended technical perfection. On a particularly busy night, Richard observed the dining room with different eyes. Table 15, an elderly couple celebrating their golden anniversary, she in a simple dress, he in an outdated suit. In the past, he would have discreetly directed them to a less visible corner. Now he guided them to one of the best tables near the window. "It's our first time here," the lady confessed, a slight tremor of insecurity in her voice. "Our children pooled money to gift us this. Then we need to make this night unforgettable," Richard replied, surprising himself with the sincerity in his own voice. He shared stories about the dishes, suggested wines that fit the budget without making a fuss about prices, and saw the couple's eyes sparkle with each discovery. During the service, Sophia appeared discreetly in the dining room, observing the interactions. Her eyes met Richard's for a moment, and he noticed a slight smile of approval. "Miller," Carmen called during a calmer moment, "that couple at 15 can't stop praising the service. The lady even cried when you brought the special dessert." Richard nodded, feeling something different in his chest. It wasn't the artificial pride of before, based on exclusion and superiority. It was something deeper, more genuine. The new training program developed by Helen Vasquez focused not only on service techniques, but on stories. Each employee was encouraged to know the Golden Crystal's history, to understand the meaning behind each dish, each tradition. "You know what impresses me the most?" commented Alexander Montgomery, who now frequently visited the restaurant as a consultant. "The change in the energy of the place. The customers feel it, the employees feel it. It's as if the restaurant has regained its soul." Richard perfectly understood what he meant. The letters that Sophia had given him had been a turning point. Some praised him effusively for his competence, but others revealed pain, humiliation, precious moments ruined by his arrogant behavior. One night, close to closing time, Sophia called him to her office again. The recipe book was open on the desk. "I found something interesting," she said, indicating a note in the margin of a page. "It's my father's handwriting. He wrote, 'The true flavor isn't just in the ingredients, but in the love with which we serve.'" Richard felt the weight of those words. "You know, Mrs. Vasquez, I spent years believing I was protecting the Golden Crystal's standards. But in reality, I was betraying its deepest essence. True elegance," Sophia replied, "is in making everyone feel special, not just a chosen few. My father knew that, LeBlanc knew that, and now, Mr. Miller, I see that you too have begun to understand." The distant sound of clinking glasses from the dining room reached them, a familiar music that now carried a new melody. Richard realized that for the first time in a long time, he felt truly part of the Golden Crystal, not just its self-proclaimed guardian. "Tomorrow," Sophia continued, "we'll begin a new project. We're going to revive some of the restaurant's original dishes, but with a new approach. And I'd like you to lead the service team in this phase." The proposal caught Richard by surprise. "Me? Even after everything?" "Especially after everything," Sophia smiled, "because now you understand that serving isn't about power or status. It's about creating memories, touching lives, being part of people's stories." The big day had arrived. After weeks of intense preparation, the Golden Crystal was about to reveal its new menu, a fusion between Antonio Vasquez's traditional recipes and modern culinary innovations. The restaurant had remained closed for 2 days, creating an aura of mystery and expectation in the city. Richard adjusted his tie in front of the locker room mirror, a familiar gesture that now carried a new meaning. It was no longer an armor of superiority, but a symbol of responsibility and respect, both for the customers and for the history of the place. "Nervous?" Carmen asked, entering the locker room with an understanding smile. "A little," Richard admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "It's as if we're reopening the restaurant for the first time." "In a way we are," she replied, adjusting her own uniform. "But this time we're all in this together." The main dining room had been subtly reorganized. In addition to the traditional tables, a communal space had been created, inspired by the old family tables of the original restaurant. Historical photographs of the Golden Crystal adorned the walls, silently telling the story of the place's evolution. Sophia gathered the team for a final briefing before opening. "Tonight is not just about food or service," she said, her voice laden with emotion. "It's about reconnection with our history, with our values, and most importantly, with the people who choose to share their lives with us, even if only for a few hours." Richard observed the faces around him. Where before he saw only subordinates, he now recognized partners, each with their own story and unique contribution to the Golden Crystal. The doors opened, and the first group of customers entered. Among them, Richard recognized familiar faces, regular customers, food critics, and even some whom he, in the past, had treated with disdain. The night flowed like a well-rehearsed symphony. Each dish told a story, presented with passion by the waiters. Richard circulated through the dining room, no longer as a silent judge, but as a host genuinely interested in each experience. "Mr. Miller," a familiar voice called. It was Mr. Rothschild, accompanied by his wife. "I must admit, we had our doubts when we heard about the changes, but this is extraordinary." "Thank you, Mr. Rothschild," Richard replied, feeling a wave of gratitude. "The Golden Crystal has evolved, but its essence remains. By the way, I'd like to introduce you to someone." He guided the couple to a nearby table where an elderly gentleman was savoring his dish with visible delight. "This is Mr. Oliveira. He worked in the Golden Crystal's kitchen in the early years, alongside Chef Antonio Vasquez." Mr. Oliveira's eyes sparkled as he shared memories of the restaurant's first days, creating an unexpected connection between past and present, between customers from different eras and origins. As the night progressed, Richard realized that something profound had changed. The Golden Crystal was no longer just a stage for his personal performance. It was a living, pulsating organism of which he was only a part. Important, but no more important than any other. Near the end of the service, Sophia discreetly called him. "There's someone who would like to speak with you," she said, guiding him to a table in the corner. Richard felt his heart race as he recognized the woman. It was the customer from Table 8, the one who had triggered the entire transformation. But this time there were no disguises, no tests, just an honest encounter between two people. "Welcome back to the Golden Crystal," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and gratitude. The woman smiled, a genuine gesture that lit up her face. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. It seems I've found a completely new place and at the same time exactly as it should be." At that moment, Richard understood that the true transformation wasn't just in the restaurant, but in himself. And this journey was far from over. Months passed since the Golden Crystal's reopening, and the implemented changes had solidified into a new identity for the restaurant. The blend of tradition and innovation not only retained the old clientele, but attracted a new generation of fine dining enthusiasts. On a quiet afternoon, before the start of service, Richard found himself alone in the main dining room. His eyes scanned the environment, absorbing every detail. The impeccably set tables were no longer territories to be defended, but stages for stories yet to be told. "Thoughtful, Mr. Miller?" Sophia's voice surprised him. Richard turned, a genuine smile on his face. "Just remembering the path we've traveled." Sophia nodded, understanding. "You know, when we decided to implement these changes, many thought we were risking too much. That we would lose our identity." "And what do you think now?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "I think we've finally found our true identity," she replied, her eyes shining. "The Golden Crystal has always been about connections, about creating moments. We had just forgotten that for a while." Richard reflected on his own transformations. The arrogance that once defined him had given way to a deeper confidence based not on superiority, but on empathy and understanding. "I have a surprise for you," Sophia said, handing him an envelope. "Open it." Inside, Richard found a series of letters. He immediately recognized the first one. It was from the elderly couple who had celebrated their golden anniversary months ago. "Dear friends at the Golden Crystal," he read aloud, his voice slightly choked. "We would like to thank you for the most special night of our lives, especially to Mr. Miller, whose kindness and attention made us feel like royalty." The letters continued, each telling a different story of special moments, unexpected kindnesses, memories created. Richard felt his eyes moisten. "These are just some of the many letters we've received in recent months," Sophia explained. "Each one of them is a testimony to the impact we can have on people's lives." At that moment, the restaurant doors opened and a familiar figure entered. Alexander Montgomery, the consultant who had participated in the Golden Crystal's transformation. "Ah, good to find you both," he said, approaching. "I have exciting news." Alexander explained that, inspired by the Golden Crystal's transformation, other traditional restaurants in the city were seeking to renew themselves, not just in menu, but in service philosophy. "And they would like you to lead a workshop on this transformation," he concluded, looking specifically at Richard. "Your personal journey, Mr. Miller, is a powerful story of change and redemption." Richard felt the weight of that responsibility, but also a wave of gratitude and purpose. "It would be an honor," he replied, his voice firm. As the restaurant began to come to life for the night's service, Richard observed the team arriving, each member bringing their own energy and passion. Carmen, now his partner in leading the service team. Paul, the maitre d', whose silent wisdom had been crucial during the transition. Sophia placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ready for another night of stories, Mr. Miller?" Richard nodded, feeling a mixture of humility and enthusiasm. "Always, Mrs. Vasquez. Each night is a new opportunity to make a difference." The dining room lights fully illuminated, bathing the environment in a welcoming glow. The first customers of the night were beginning to arrive, each bringing with them expectations, stories, and the possibility of unforgettable moments. Richard adjusted his tie one last time, not as a gesture of superiority, but as a reminder of his journey and responsibility. The Golden Crystal was no longer just a restaurant. It was a place of encounters, of redemption, of stories in constant evolution. As he went to receive the first customers, Richard carried with him not only the refined technique of years of experience, but something much more valuable, the understanding that each interaction was an opportunity to touch a life, to create a memory, to be part of something greater than himself. The Golden Crystal had transformed, and with it, Richard Miller. And this transformation, he now knew, was an ongoing process, as rich and complex as the dishes they served, as deep and varied as the stories that unfolded each night in that dining room.